I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. So today we're really excited to have Dr. Peter Attia on our podcast, and we also have Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director, with us.
Thank you, Don. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. So we were just talking about how the esteemed Dr. Attia was chosen for this podcast. Can you give us a little information about how IHMC came to choose Dr. Attia as one of our guests?
In fact, he's one of our inaugural guests, and all the guests for this podcast are selected by the same very grueling selection process. It's a double secret selection committee chaired by myself. Selects every one of the guests, and Peter was one of the first ones that sprang to the committee's collective hive mind.
Well, I think he's a perfect choice and a very, very lucky man to be chosen by that committee.
Yeah, I'm beyond influence.
So Dr. Attia has a pretty interesting background, very eclectic background.
I'll say.
Yeah. And do you know Dr. Attia personally, Ken?
Yes, I know him pretty well and consider him a friend. Peter's a kind of a Renaissance man, and that word gets thrown around a lot, but in this case it sort of fits. Right? So Peter is a top-drawer physician, former McKinsey consultant. This is a premier consulting firm, a ultra-endurance athlete, like swimming to Catalina Island and other ridiculous stunts, a relentless self-experimenter, and most recently, president and co-founder of NUSI, a not-for-profit he founded with Gary Taubes.
And now he's focused on longevity, and that's actually what he's going to be talking about in today's podcast.
Oh, it'll be terrific. And Peter's just the guy to hear from on this topic. I believe he's going to share with us his primary drivers of longevity and health span.
And some of these drivers make sense. They're kind of common sense, like don't do illegal drugs, drive with a seatbelt on.
My favorite one is don't do stupid things.
Don't do stupid things.
But that's actually the hardest one to obey. I know people that obey the other 7 and they fail on don't do stupid things.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
So first off, I just want to start off by welcoming Dr. Peter Attia to today's podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
So Peter, let's just get started with your background. You studied math and engineering before you went into medical school. What drove you into being interested in medicine?
It's kind of a long story, so I have to think how to give the abridged version. But I was always interested in aerospace engineering, which is why I studied mechanical engineering and math. But at the same time, when I was in college, for reasons I'm not sure why, I just volunteered at a kids' hospital and volunteered with a group of kids who were abused. And sometime around my senior year, I became much more interested in the plight of these kids and young adults that I was seeing in the hospital. And for reasons I won't go into here, just felt that maybe my calling was actually to go into medicine and not aerospace engineering. And so I, just sort of made that decision after I graduated, and I bypassed the PhD program I was going to go to and decided to, take the prerequisites to go to med school and then begin that path. So kind of nonlinear, but sort of a change of heart.
Well, when one thinks about it, in today's emerging medical environment, math and engineering are pretty useful backgrounds.
Yes, I've never regretted it, and to this day I find myself still in the fortunate position of having undergrad students reach out to me and high school students reach out to me asking, what do you recommend I should study in college before I, apply to medical school? And my advice is always generally the same, which is I think you should study anything that is not what you're going to learn in medical school. There's really no need to study biochemistry or anatomy or anything that has to do with physiology, because you're going to learn that all. You're much better off learning something that will teach you a set of skills that will be valuable there. And for me, there was probably no better thing to have spent all that time working on than engineering and mathematics. And they still, in many ways, color how I think about the world.
Absolutely. So at a certain point, you switched from clinical medicine to studying nutrition and then eventually taking on an interest in longevity. So how did that happen?
Well, it's sort of, so I left clinical medicine largely due to, the same sort of frustrations that I think, I had a friend who once said to me that there are only two things that drive significant change in a person's life. One is abject misery, and the other is profound inspiration. And if I look back at my life, that's always been the case, right? So anytime I've undergone an orthogonal change in direction, it's been one of those two. And the decision to leave medicine was more the former than the latter. I was really frustrated with everything that had to do with the system. I was frustrated with how we trained residents. I thought it was a horribly inefficient system. I was frustrated with, what I referred to as our continued defiance of natural selection, meaning this idea of, endless resources being spent, to eke out incremental days or weeks of life at inordinate cost. So the whole system just didn't make sense to me. So I left that. And then to your second question, the longevity stuff, I think became a real interest in about 2008, 2009, just on a personal level when my daughter was born. And I think that was sort of there's a step function change in a person's life, I think, there. And you realize that, it's not just about you anymore. But also in my case, I think I also just was amazed at how much I enjoyed her existence and realized that now quantity of life mattered as much as quality, whereas previously I think I'd only thought about quality of life.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
So to kick us off, let's just go briefly over what you've identified as the 8 key longevity drivers. And if you could just kind of give a brief overview for each of them, and then we'll go back and talk about each of them in more detail later on in the podcast.
Well, if it's okay with you, maybe even before jumping into that, I think it's worth setting the stage for why I think it's worth framing the problem that way. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So I've thought about this problem a lot, and this might actually be where engineering comes in handy. So the problem of longevity, it seems to me that you always want to find natural experiments. And the most obvious place to look for natural experiments is within our own species. And so we look to the centenarians. And these are people who obviously by definition live to be 100 or more. And there are enough of these people around that a few patterns have emerged. And people like Nir Brazili at Albert Einstein have studied these people and written about them extensively. And one of the most interesting things that I observed in reading this literature was that centenarians die of basically the same diseases everybody else dies of in about the same distribution, with one exception, which is they just get the disease 20 to 30 years later. This is important, right? Why? Because if centenarians all died in car accidents or plane crashes, you might be left with the impression that they are completely and genetically immune to chronic illness, and that eventually they just die when something else kills them, right? Like we'd all die of an accident if we could be immortal from a chronic disease standpoint. But that's not the case, right? So they still die of heart disease. They still die of cancer. They still die of, Alzheimer's disease. They just get these diseases much later in life. So the first observation is that longevity is first and foremost about delaying the onset of chronic disease. And I say chronic disease because that's really what's going to kill the majority of us, especially when you live in the Western world and you've, rooted out a lot of the infant mortality, the infectious diseases, all of these other things. There's about a 70 to 80% chance you're going to die from cerebrovascular, cardiovascular, cancer, or neurodegenerative disease, of which Alzheimer's is far and away the most common. So the first step in thinking about longevity is how do you delay the onset of chronic disease? And to me, that's actually a much simpler problem to go after than the broader statement of how do you live longer. And so that's the first sort of natural experiment you would look at. The second thing I would turn to is the animal literature on longevity. And you have to be careful how you interpret it, right? Because the animal literature has shown us that there's certainly one intervention that seems to not always but often produce results, longevity results across most species, and that's caloric restriction. I think we're also seeing evidence that pharmacologic agents that inhibit that inhibit MTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin, also tend to produce longevity. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that caloric restriction may not actually produce longevity in the wild, even within animals, and it certainly may not be an appropriate solution in humans in the wild. But can we learn something from it? And so the second theme that emerges, in addition to this understanding of what happens with centenarians, is what are the CR mimetics, meaning caloric restriction mimetics, things that mimic whatever the beneficial impact of caloric restriction is, and how can we apply those things? And I think that comes down to nutrient sensing. And so, okay, with those two big things said, yeah, I think there are 8 variables, levers, tools, call them what you want, that we have some control over, because we don't really have control over our genes. And so we know from the genetic studies of the centenarians that, they might actually have a differential expression of ApoC3, and they might actually have less IGF and all of these other things. But we can't really control those things genetically. The question is, can we control and manipulate those things through quote unquote lifestyle, a term that I hate? And I think the answer is yes, right? So I think those 8 things that we have control over that can both enhance our lifespan, i.e. make us live longer, and enhance our health span, make us live better, are what we eat, how we move, which of course includes how we exercise, how we sleep, how we manage chronic stress, how our hormones are optimized, what drugs we take, what our sense of purpose is, and to some extent our social support network, and are we able to avoid harmful behaviors? There's always going to be, and most people are surprised to learn this, the 4th or 5th leading cause of death in the United States is accidental death, which is of course a waste bucket term, but it's still an enormous number of people who die by accident. And within that, of course, auto is the largest by far, followed by accidental poisoning, followed by falls. And so auto accident, accidental poisoning, and falls account for 80% of all accidental deaths, and accidental deaths are the 4th or 5th leading cause of death. So we can mitigate a lot of those things as well. And those are, I kind of think of some of those things as pretty low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, it seems like some of those might be pretty easy while others might be more difficult.
Certainly. It seems that in many cases, given our current and often modest level of knowledge, that when you look at drivers of longevity and the options we all have, that we face suboptimal trade-offs. We look at lifestyle, nutrition, exercise choices, and you can find a benefit associated with longevity, and you might find a benefit with another choice associated with health span, and they might not be the same. And I think this notion of trade-off is fascinating, and I think you've thought about this a good bit, and this is likely to come up, I think, the rest of our discussion today.
I saw a patient today in my office who was inquiring about a certain hormonal intervention, which unquestionably is going to increase his quality of life in the short run. But it was important for me to explain to him that in his case, this was also going to significantly increase his risk for, cancer. And so, I had to explain to him why that's the case. And it's not to say one is right or one is wrong. It's you've just got to appreciate the trade-off that's going on in this particular case. And then, of course, the same is true with our choices in nutrition and our choices in exercise.
Absolutely.
I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
So speaking of nutrition, you name that as one of the key drivers of longevity, and I'm sure you get this question a lot. But what kind of food should we be eating to increase longevity?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's that simple, right? And it varies by individual. So I think it, again, comes down to a handful of themes. We have to go back to what do we know about caloric restriction? What is it about caloric restriction that is producing a desired outcome? And what is it that's not, by the way? Because again, I think, when you speak to some of the most sophisticated people in this space, the people that I look to as my mentors, guys like Steve Austed, Dave Sabatini, who, by the way, is the guy that discovered mTOR. I think most people believe that caloric restriction actually in humans would not produce a longevity survival and longevity advantage. Even had this discussion with Walter Longo, who I was actually surprised that was his point of view as well, which was, a calorically restricted individual is likely going to have a lower risk of diabetes and heart disease and cancer, but they're likely going to succumb to something catastrophic much sooner, right? They're going to have immune deficiency. They're going to be far more susceptible to falls, to these other things. So what is it about CR that mattered? What's the good stuff, right? The good stuff has to do, I believe, with an environment of cell signaling, cell growth, and nutrient sensing that is all promoting delayed growth. So what does that look like? At the top level, that means mTOR activity is generally going to be lower. Now, that turns out to be one of the hardest things to measure. We can only measure that in snapshots. We can't integrate that. So the inability to integrate biologic signals, to me, is one of the greatest challenges with studying longevity in a super rigorous level, right? So hemoglobin A1C is a sort of rare exception where you have an integral. It's a crappy integral, by the way, but it, in theory, gives you 90 days worth of glucose. If we have time, I'd like to come back and go off on that a little bit more, because I have a new tool that I'm using that makes this more interesting to study. But when it comes to like IGF levels or activity or mTOR, we just get these snapshots. But nevertheless, we want to see that. We want to err on the less active side there. We want to see IGF levels lower. We want to see AMP kinase more active. We want to see RAS less active. And so how do we do that? Well, that really comes down to a couple of things, two big things. The first is efficient glucose disposal at the lowest level of insulin possible. That's one. And then the second one is probably the lowest amount of protein intake necessary that is sufficient to maintain muscle mass. So we don't want to go too far on protein restriction, because while we get a whole bunch of benefits, i.e. those that we see with caloric restriction, we can actually see some downside. Anything that's going to reduce muscle mass is going to be bad in the long run. I'll talk more about that in the exercise section. On the other side, we have to make sure that glucose intake is limited to that which the individual can dispose of quickly and efficiently without any hyperinsulinemia. And so again, if you think about this from an AUC perspective, which means area under the curve, while we can't do this in a practical setting, we can only do this in the lab. You take an individual and you draw their insulin level every 30 minutes over 24 hours, you can generate a curve. And the area under that curve, called the AUC, you want that to be minimized. And so you want that to be minimized, of course, in the context of disposing of glucose. So someone with type 1 diabetes would have a 0 AUC, but that's not good, of course, because they're not putting any glucose away. So the challenge is, how do you minimize the, if you think about this mathematically, how do you minimize mu, which is the mean level of glucose, sigma, the variability of glucose, and the AUC of insulin? Those are the three things I basically walk through life asking, how can I keep those three things to a minimum? So now you're probably thinking, Peter, why don't you say one thing that's practical here? So what does that actually mean, right? So it varies highly by the patient. I can tell you in great detail what it means for me, right? So as Ken knows, I spent about 3 years in nutritional ketosis, which is a really fun experiment. And I'm sure you've had others on this show, and Ken himself knows this as well as anybody. So you know what nutritional ketosis is. Now, I'm not in nutritional ketosis anymore. But I'm eating probably no more than about 125 to 150 grams of carbohydrate a day. It's a very specific type of carbohydrate, and the time of day at which I consume it is such that I've basically figured out how to game the system. I know when to consume carbohydrate to dispose of it maximally. That also speaks to the tools that you can use to do this. So I wear a continuous glucose monitor. So I have a device that's implanted in my just in my belly, like anterior abdominal wall. It's a disposable device, so you change it every 10 days, and it's measuring glucose every 5 minutes. So I have basically continuous real-time glucose readings, and that's been a very powerful tool to help me appreciate the impacts of exercise and stress and various dietary intakes on my glucose level. So I know what my average glucose level is running, for a 30-day period of time, and I'm constantly thinking about how to keep that at a minimum.
That makes sense. You mentioned the ketogenic diet, and as you know, for over a decade, I've enjoyed what one might characterize, or certainly Jeff Volek would characterize, as a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And I saw a lot of physical and cognitive benefits, and I sort of hope that the elevated ketone levels are prophylactic with respect to several diseases associated with aging. Plus, I just feel better. But interestingly, you mentioned circulating IGF-1, and when you're in ketosis, your circulating IGF-1 goes down about 30%, and mTOR is down. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, in theory, if you think about the extremes of my framework, it does point to a ketogenic diet. Why? Because the mTOR is driven by amino acids, right? So David Sabatini's group at MIT in September published a paper that showed that they basically identified what the sensor was, and it's a leucine sensor, right? So it's certainly sensitive to other amino acids, but leucine runs the board on that. So if you want mTOR to be low activity, you don't want a heck of a lot of amino acids floating around, i.e. you want protein to be relatively low. And we know that IGF is driven by two things, right? And there's some debate in the world on this. There are some people who think it's purely just driven by amino acids, specifically methionine. And then there are others like me who think that that's half of it, but half of it is actually related to insulin because of the effect of insulin on IGF binding protein. And so it's a two-pronged issue, right, which is how much IGF is being produced and then how much of that IGF is actually available. And so if you go through the math, you'd say, well, gosh, the ideal diet should be one that minimizes glucose to minimize insulin, but also minimizes protein, which, of course, a well-formulated ketogenic diet has relatively small amounts of protein in it because you spare so many amino acids. And the majority of the diet becomes fat. And it's really funny every time I talk to sort of one of the godfathers in this space, and I walk them through this, they completely agree with you until you get to so then the rest is fat. Because then I say, well, wait a minute, that can't be right, right? So it's like, totally agree that you want, there's no reason to have 500 grams of carbohydrate a day, and you don't need 200 grams of protein a day, but you got to eat something. So I think for individuals for whom a ketogenic diet works, and I was certainly one of them, you are one of them, Dom. We have lots of friends who are in that camp who just have remarkable responses to ketogenic diets. I think it's a remarkable tool. That said, I've had the privilege of taking care of a lot of people for whom ketogenic diets don't work very well. And I haven't figured out why.
There seems to be a genetic basis there, and that's something I'm looking into more. And it would make sense that people would have variation in that respect.
I agree, yeah. And it's frustrating to me to no end. And it's frustrating for the patients because you see a lot of patients who they just want this so badly to work, and it doesn't, and there's no denying it. When you see their LDLP skyrocket to 3,500 nanomoles per liter, when you see their CRP skyrocket, when you see all of these changes that go in the wrong direction from a lipoprotein standpoint, from an inflammatory standpoint, from a hormonal standpoint, you can tweak it all you want. You can say, well, maybe there's too much omega-6, or maybe you got to go more monounsaturated versus saturated fat, but you've only got a handful of levers to pull there, and in the end, you sometimes have to just acknowledge that this diet is not optimal for this person. And yet, interestingly, I'll take that patient and I'll put them onto a relatively carbohydrate-restricted, non-ketogenic diet, and we can have amazing results. So one of the things I'm hesitant about getting into the diet discussion is I really think that, we do patients a huge disservice when we sort of talk about the diet versus talking about the molecules and the physiology. And so if a patient comes in to see me, I tell them up front, I'm completely agnostic to the diet, right? If you tell me you want to be a vegetarian, fine, we'll make this work for a vegetarian. But let's think about what the molecules are and what the biochemistry looks like to produce our optimal change. And then to your point, Ken, we might have to make some trade-offs. There might have to be an optimization cost curve here.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at all the various biomarkers and now the rich genetic information available to each of us, it seems like we're all engaged in a series of trade-offs. For example, earlier you talked about leucine, and no doubt leucine is a powerful stimulator of mTOR, but it's very tissue specific.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very tissue specific, right? And so, I mean, so once I saw that paper, and of course I'd spoken with David about it months before it came out. So even before it came out, I went out and got Dom actually helped me find some really good pharmacologic grade leucine. So what I'd start doing is during my workouts, I'd actually spike my drink with 5 grams of leucine for in workout, right? Meaning
that's what I do as well.
Yeah, while I'm in the midst of working out, I actually want mTOR in my muscle, and to be really specific, it's mTORC1 that we want, right? It's this complex 1 of mammalian target rapamycin, and I want within the muscle, which by the way, the muscle has a higher affinity for leucine than the other tissue sources of mTOR. I want that guy completely saturated with it. And by the way, when you're providing free leucine, it has a very short half-life. So, you're going to pee most of that out anyway. So yeah, leucine deficiency, absolutely problematic. But then of course, the other end of that spectrum is if you're mainlining this stuff 24/7, you switch it over. And that's, biology. A really smart guy once told me that one of the problems with biology is it keeps reusing the pieces over and over again. And that's the problem, right? It's very rare to find tissue specificity. The thing that turns on the thing that turns on mTOR in the liver and the fat and the muscle, it's kind of the same thing. And yet we don't want them all firing or all not firing. So it becomes very challenging to hack that system. And it's the exception when we find tissue specificity, right? So you look at over-the-counter proton pump inhibitors like Prilosec. That's a remarkable drug when you think about it. It's managing to inhibit the proton pump within the parietal cell within the stomach. That's amazing. Imagine it inhibited that cell in every part of the body. It would be a lethal drug.
Yeah, you'd be dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, I think that it's a sensible approach to ingest, depending on your size, 3 to 5 grams of leucine intra-workout, during the workout, and otherwise not be slamming protein all day.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Specificity generally wins the day.
So, Peter, let's talk about the role of insulin in disease causation. You mentioned this, we've talked about this a little bit up to this point. You have this great blog that you put out there called The Eating Academy, which is an incredible resource to the community. But it used to be named The War on Insulin. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. When I started it in 2011, it was The War on Insulin because it seemed too long to write The War on Insulin Resistance, which was really what I wanted it to be. And I'm glad it's not the war on insulin resistance, because I've now come to realize nobody actually knows what insulin resistance is, myself included, right? And I mean, I don't know that I'd speak for him, and he might get upset if I said this, but I'm not even sure if Jerry Reaven knows what insulin resistance is. And I think most people would agree Jerry Reaven is the godfather of insulin resistance. So Jerry Reaven is a scientist, an endocrinologist at Stanford who is amazing, right? I mean, he's just this legend of a man. He's the guy who basically identified what was originally referred to as Syndrome X in the mid-90s that we now refer to as metabolic syndrome. So he identified this cluster of issues, right? And the cluster is truncal obesity, elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, elevated triglycerides, and depressed HDL cholesterol. And when you see those things together, where those 5 things go, so too do really bad things go. Jerry, of course, also pioneered a test called the insulin suppression test, which, along with something called the euglycemic clamp, is really the gold standard for measuring glucose disposal. But we still have this term called insulin resistance. Now, we all sort of know in theory what it means, right? Which is, well, it means that you need a lot more insulin to do the job of insulin. So if someone would normally produce 20 units, you might require 60 units to do the same amount of glucose disposal. And I think it's fine to leave the definition as that. But of course, where it runs into trouble is the same thing we were just talking about a minute ago. well, wait a minute, how's the effect of insulin on a different tissue? When a person's insulin resistant, they seem actually more likely to put on adipose tissue, to get fatter. But that seems like a paradox, right? That would seem like the adipose tissue is actually quite insulin sensitive. So is insulin sensitive, when we say insulin resistant, do we mean the muscle becomes more resistant to insulin, but the fat cell becomes more sensitive to insulin? And what does it say about the hepatocyte? That's a totally different thing. So, okay, so long-winded way of saying I don't have a clue what I'm talking about when it comes to this, and I'm not sure anybody does, but I sure do love talking about it with people who are smarter than me.
Hey, you're listening to STEM Talk, and we're interviewing Dr. Peter Attia. You can find out more information on some of the things that he's talking about in today's interview at his personal blog, eatingacademy.com, where he talks a little bit more about ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, and some of the other approaches that he's discussing with respect to improving wellness and longevity.
Earlier, when you mentioned IGF-1, and if we look at a recent paper is looking at exceptionally long-lived humans, and we find overall, as you might surmise, quite low levels of circulating IGF-1. But in this paper, the effects seem to be very clearly gender-specific. So this wasn't...
it favored women, didn't it, if I recall?
Yes, there was no difference in males, but in women it was pretty noticeable. And then it had a big impact in both genders if you had a previous history of cancer,
if I recall.
Right. And I thought that was fascinating.
So that was Neer's group at Albert Einstein.
It was a very interesting study.
Yep. Not sure what to make of it, of course, because it's retrospective, and that's all we're ever going to get. There will never be a prospective study in this, but I take it. Again, I think the precautionary principle has to be taken into account. Right, which is the preponderance of evidence suggests that lower levels of IGF are better for longevity, and in particular, but there's a nuance here, by the way, that is really interesting. The nuance is this: central levels of IGF, when they're higher, produce better cognitive outcomes than lower. So this gets back to the quandary of biology, like. It would almost be pleasant if we could just say low IGF across the board is the way to go, except for this little observation, which is low IGF from the neck down appears to be a really good thing, especially with respect to cancer, but also cardiovascular disease. But high IGF levels above the neck seems to be a good thing when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. And so the holy grail, of course, and you can see where this is going, is the IGF antibody, right? So a pharmacologic agent that peripherally blocks the IGF receptor. So it's actually an antibody to the IGF receptor. So it blocks IGF, but it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah, when you look at IGF-1, and also you mentioned MTOR extensively earlier, these are classic examples of the trade-off problem we discussed earlier. They play critical roles in muscle protein synthesis, and one of the topics that I think is underattended to in society, and in particular in the average clinician's office, is sarcopenia. And it's a real problem with serious outcomes. And so, again, there seems to be a trade-off at hand there to some extent. Weak and fragile does not make an exciting future. One can go to a nursing home and look around and appreciate that. And so I think this is a fascinating trade-off, and I think we're just scratching the surface on IGF-1. Some of the most recent research in sarcopenia indicates that one of the drivers for this is a general anabolic hormone resistance, very much like insulin resistance that we earlier agreed that we don't fully understand. But these people are demonstrating IGF-1 resistance at the receptor level. I think that's interesting.
It really is. And when we talk about exercise, I'll hopefully make this point as well, that muscle mass matters.
Absolutely.
And the more of it you have, the better. And it doesn't matter if you're a woman or you're a man. We should all be striving to have as much muscle as we can in a functional capacity.
So, Peter, let's move into exercise. You've identified that as another key driver of longevity. And I've heard you say that most of us train in a quote-unquote no-man's zone. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's two reasons to sort of train, and this is again just my opinion, which I think can be taken out of context and bastardized. But one is you train for a certain physiologic response. So we should train to be the athletes of our life, to be better at living. Right? That's one approach to training. The other is the massive specificity that goes into training to do a specific thing as well as possible. Okay, so what do both of those look like? So I'll give you examples just from my life. I mean, I've done a handful of things competitively in my life, but I guess most recently swimming and cycling would have been the two. And never together, by the way. So in other words, if I was really focused on trying to be the best swimmer I could be, that was sort of everything I did was geared towards that. And similarly, if I'm focusing to be the best cyclist I could be, that was the only thing I worried about. Everything was supportive of that goal. But those are very specific tasks, right? So in swimming, I was like a 100-meter breaststroke and a 200-meter IM. Those are races that are over in like 2 minutes, right? Like you're going to train 16 hours a week to deliver maximum ATP turnover. You're going to burn every match in 2 minutes. That's a tremendous amount of specificity, right? So it's almost a perfectly choreographed set of movements. And similarly in cycling, I was not a road guy, I was a time trial guy. So that's a 20-kilometer time trial is a race that's over in less than half an hour. And again, highly choreographed, highly specific. It's a physiologic response. You are trying to take, in the case of that time trial, you are trying to take what is called your functional threshold power, make it as high as possible, and then learn how to park yourself right at that level for 30 minutes in a very uncomfortable position that is geared towards maximum aerodynamics. And that's it. So to train for those things, there's a certain way to do it, and most people don't appreciate it, understandably. And I certainly can't train like that anymore because when you don't have a goal like that, it's just way too painful to do that. But then at the other end of the spectrum, there's training to be the athlete of your life, which is saying, okay, I'm a 43-year-old dude. I got a couple kids. I got, my job. I got my family. I've got these obligations. What am I optimizing for? Am I trying to be like the best CrossFitter? No, probably not. What do I want to do? Well, I want to not get hurt. How about that for starters? 2, I want to be able to play indefinitely. Right? I want to be able to play with my great-grandkids wherever they're going to be. I want to be able to do X. I want to be able to do Y. I want to be able to, go to the hardware store and pick up something that weighs 200 pounds and not kill myself. To me, that's being the athlete of your life. And so there's a very specific way to train for that. But then there's everything in the middle, which is the, kind of the weekend warrior who's out there hammering on his bike, thinking he's sort of becoming a good cyclist, but of course he's horrible. And
always,
but he's always hurting, but he's always, but more importantly, he's risking hurting himself or herself. And you get these injuries that show up and all this other stuff going on. And so, that's that no man's land that I'm probably not doing a very good job being articulate about, that I try to get my patients out of that. I say, let's pick one and go with it. If you want to be the best 20K time trial cyclist, here's how we do it. I will tell you that personally, you have to understand that's not enhancing your longevity. In fact, it's almost assuredly reducing your longevity. But if you, and I can't tell you how many patients I have because a lot of my patients used to be super elite athletes. I mean, many of them, I can think of 6 off the top of my head, have had atrial fibrillation and have required ablations. So that's one of the prices you'll pay.
You described that beautifully, the trade-off between exercise for health and longevity and exercise specificity at a very high level for a particular sport. People confuse those two, and you did a very nice job sorting it out, I think.
Yeah, that was great.
So let's talk about the life one, because that's the one that I think matters, right? So if the goal is how do you become the athlete of your life, this is where I think nothing trumps resistance training. And I say this for 2 reasons, right? One goes back to the glucose disposal thing. Glucose disposal at its crudest level has 2 inputs, right? One is what goes in the system and what goes out of the system. So we've addressed the putting glucose in the system. That's what you're eating. The where does the glucose go is a function of how do you dispose of it. Well, in the short term, we only have 3 ways to dispose of glucose. And one of them you can take off the table, which is immediate utilization, because that's relatively clamped, right? For most of us, disposing of glucose while we're on a bicycle pedaling 287 watts is not really the issue, where you can rapidly dispose of glucose. So now it's really a question of how much of it can you put in the liver? And the answer is relatively little. It's relatively finite. But then the second place is how much of it can you put in the muscle as glycogen? And the answer turns out to be a heck of a lot. And you can train to increase the capacity of that. So you want to think about the muscle as a glycogen reservoir. It's a place to dispose of glucose. It's the sink. And the more sensitive that muscle is to taking in glucose, to disposing of it, as we say, to putting it into this form of glycogen, the better you're going to be. In fact, the more you'll be able to tolerate glucose on the input side of things. And so that's one reason. The second reason comes down to this functional thing, which is we can't lose sight of the fact that, sarcopenia, of course, is an extreme state, but frankly, many people, when they get older, their quality of life is going down due to lack of mobility, due to lack of strength, due to lack of symmetry. And those are things we have to be very, very diligent about, and especially by the time we turn 40, when the loss of muscle mass starts to actually accelerate. And so even if you didn't change your activity at the age of 40, you're going to start to lose muscle. So if anything, it becomes paramount that we increase not just strength training, but a very specific type of strength training that activates and recruits the type 2B fiber, which is something that, again, that it's very deliberate. Most people simply aren't lifting weights in a manner that recruits that 2B fiber, and therefore they're spending a lot of time exercising and they're not getting the benefit.
Right. I recently saw a guy on an elliptical machine going so slow that he was able to watch TV, play with his iPad, and eat part of a pizza.
Was he at Planet Fitness?
No. Well, it could have been. I was on the road, so I went to one of these box gyms on the road, and it was quite a sight to see. And I was in the gym for an hour, and he was there when I got there, and he was there when I left. And it was the opposite of everything you just said. You're listening to STEM Talk, where we introduce the listener to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
So, Peter, let's switch over to talk about stress. You identified stress management as another driver of longevity. You don't necessarily tell people to reduce stress, but to learn how to manage negative stress responses. Can you explain that a little further?
Yeah, so we evolved, and again, I think I'm guilty of this just as the next person is. We do tend to, refer to we do tend to call up evolutionary biology maybe more than we should, right? But I think it's because it's not always the answer, but it's generally a good place to start, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, we didn't really evolve with the levels of chronic stress that we have today. So we're pretty well adapted to dealing with acute stress. But it's this chronic stress that's a relatively new phenomenon. So you could take a couple of approaches to this. One, you could move to a blue zone and do whatever people do in the blue zones, and that's great. But people who come to me don't have that option, right? Like they're hustling in New York, they're hustling here, they're hustling where, they just don't have those. So the answer can't really be take the stress out of your life. At least if it is, I haven't figured out how one does that, right? I mean, yes, maybe if you have a miserable marriage, you get out of it. Maybe if your business partner's a jerk, you get rid of him or her. But the reality of it is, I think that could also be an exercise in futility, right? The better thing is probably, can you change your the way that you react to and cope with stress? And so, for me, the single biggest tool in this has been a journey that started about 1.5 years ago, which has been the use of meditation. And there are many different forms of meditation, and the literature on this is pretty messy, meaning it's not entirely clear from the literature if, mindfulness and open monitoring and transcendental have dramatically different clinical outcomes. And in my experience with my patients, I think that what matters more than anything is consistency. and pick one and run with it. And the one that's going to be right for you is probably the one that you're going to want to do and the one that you're going to be willing to do every day. And for me, that is transcendental meditation. So I was taught by this incredible guy in New York named Bob Roth, and it has just become an instrumental part of my life. Now, in addition to that, there are other tricks and trades for sort of the particularly high-strung guys and girls, and so there are other sort of elements that we can take, meaning like elemental agents that you can ingest, such as lithium. During periods of particularly high stress, I've noticed that phosphatidylserine has become a remarkable sleep agent, and it really suppresses the adrenal glands in the evening, because the worst thing you want to do is have this reversed pattern where you have high levels of cortisol in the evening and lower levels during the day. We want to flip that, right? And so phosphatidylserine, for reasons I don't actually understand, I don't understand the mechanism, but it really does suppress the adrenal glands in the evening and promotes remarkable sleep during these periods of stress. So that's sort of how I think about that. And I think that, frankly, I think that's the hardest one of the 8 for me personally. I think for some people, what they eat might be the hardest thing, or how they exercise might be the hardest thing. But for me, there's no doubt that, keeping cortisol levels in check requires the most work.
Yep, that's a tough one. I find heart rate variability feedback helpful.
Have you found a good? I just haven't found a tool that I believe is accurate enough. What are you using?
I'm using the Heart Math Institute tool. It uses the standard algorithm. It's one that came out of MIT that they're all based on. But I use it as sort of a feedback system and for breathing and relaxation. And it works for me because I haven't been able to – I'm not very much of a meditative sort of guy, right? Sort of and this is one way to get in a relaxed state and feel thankful about things. And you get a feedback. You can see the lights change, and you can see that you've at least done something useful.
Oh, let's talk about it offline, because I'd like to give it a try. The other thing I've noticed on the stress stuff is, because I wear a continuous glucose monitor, what I've noticed during periods of high stress, my average glucose during sleep is higher than when I'm awake and eating. And so why is that happening? So when I'm sleeping, and that tends to be when I ruminate and sort of all my anxieties come out, you see cortisol production go up. And what does that do? Well, that drives hepatic glucose output. And so I could go to bed after dinner with a glucose of 87, and at midnight have a glucose of 140. My high, because I have an alarm on my thing. It's like if my blood glucose ever gets above 140, it starts freaking out. So my wife loves this stupid meter, because like the thing will be chirping at me at $1.40 in the middle of the night, and she wants to throw it out the window. And of course, that probably doesn't help the cortisol level.
Well, Peter, let's talk about sleep. So I know when I was a grad student, we always would pride ourselves in pulling multiple all-nighters and, getting through whatever work or whatever exams we had in front of us. And I was surrounded by students that were not just grad students, but also med students. So it was kind of the same mentality of pulling these all-nighters and who could get the minimal amount of sleep and still seemingly operate effectively. At least we thought we were operating effectively. What do we mean when we're talking about sleep hygiene? What's the optimal preparation for sleep, and how important is that with respect to longevity?
Well, I think this is another one of those examples where we can learn a lot from our ancestors, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is, and I've always, and I can't take credit for this insight, Kirk Parsley, who's a close friend of mine, and really I kind of call him my sleep mentor. Kirk is he's a doctor. He works specifically around sleep within patients, but also the overall endocrine system. He used to be a Navy SEAL, and I think both his training and such as a SEAL, and then his subsequent care for Navy SEALs as a doctor gave him just an enormous appreciation of how much of a problem this is. And he made this amazing point when I initially, this is probably 3 years ago, sort of balked at the notion of needing to really tune up my sleep. Right? He said, "Well, think about it this way, Peter. Our ancestors spent about a third of their time sleeping. And, from an evolutionary perspective, that's a pretty dangerous behavior. To be unconscious for a third of the time, probably not a great thing. So why the hell did we not evolve a way out of that? Because that would have been an unbelievable survival benefit if you could have figured out a way to not sleep. And yet it didn't happen, suggesting that while there's a huge danger in spending a third of your life unconscious, the benefit must have eclipsed it. So that's sort of macro point number one. Macro point number two is when you look at clinical trials of sleep, they do point to this idea of about 7.5 to 8.5 hours is the right amount. Now, I know there was this study that came out kind of recently from a group at either USC or UCLA that suggested that might not be the case. And Kirk has actually written something nice about it. I'm not going to get into why I think that study was a little bit flawed, but I would argue more importantly, it's sort of irrelevant because it was not a population that relates to us. But when you look at sort of the military studies where you take sleep-deprived people and you look at what it takes for them to reacclimate, they all tend to gravitate towards once the sleep debt's sort of paid off, they're in the 7.5 to 8.5. Okay. And again, whether our ancestors did that all in one stretch or not is not clear. So maybe the answer is you sleep 4, you wake up and do something and then you go back. But nevertheless, the biggest thing I think that inhibits us from sleeping is just a handful of couple, sort of structural things. So one is the amount of light that we encounter after the sun has gone down. So we're pretty hardwired to have this really cool thing happen, right? Which is when light goes away, the pineal gland, in the absence of light, starts to secrete melatonin, and that's sort of our natural sleeping aid. And so we kind of screwed that thing up, right? And again, to the spirit of trade-offs, is that a good trade-off? I think it was. I'll take electricity over sleeping in a cave any day of the week. So the question is, what can you do within the system to say, look, I still want to be like the modern man, but how can I? So a couple things that we can do is, one, you could just be disciplined about it and say, look, I'm not going to look at electronics after 6 or 7 p.m. But for many people, it gets back to it's like telling somebody to be less stressed out. I mean, I don't know. I couldn't stop looking at electronics at 7 p.m. because I have too much work to do, or at least I think I'm busy enough that I have too much work to do, right? So there's a great app called Flux, F.LUX, that you can put on your computer that strips out the blue light from your computer, your iPad, or whatever it is once the sun goes down. So it's sort of synced to the GPS of your computer, and it knows when to pull the light in and out of your computer. The second thing is being a little bit disciplined about it, which is not having electronics in the room. So I now violate that by having my phone in the room because of my glucose meter, but I keep it like really far away and it's off. So it's not I'm not off, but it's like, I don't see the light of it, right? But I don't have like an iPad in the room. I don't have a TV in the room or any of that stuff. And I do try to spend at least an hour doing something that is not looking at light before bed. The other thing is the temperature of the room. It's, the colder, the better. So, in California, that's really easy to do because we don't have insulated homes. So, it's probably 60, 65 degrees in the room. And then after that, there are other, in my experience, sort of half the people just get better doing that. And then of course there's make sure you have enough time. So that's if you have to be up at 6, you really want to be in the bed by 10. And even if you read for a little bit, read a book or something like that. But I'd like it if you could not, do that right before bed just because of the light. So then there are just a handful of compounds. So we've talked about phosphatidylserine. We've talked about low doses of lithium before bed, helping sleep. Talked about, GABA, melatonin, tryptophan. Yeah, exactly, 5-HTP. There are a whole bunch of cocktails of these things. In fact, Kirk makes a cocktail that's like a sleep supplement that has all of those. I don't think it has the phosphatidylserine in it, but you can add that on top. And, these things are really great. The other thing I try to explain to patients is the problem with using the sort of traditional go-to sleep agents like Ambien. Because sleep is not, it's easily confused for a lack of consciousness, but it's actually much more than that, right? So if you think about this thought experiment, if you take a person and hit them over the head with a baseball bat and you see them lying face down in the parking lot, you would never assume that they're sleeping there. They're just unconscious. And so similarly, just because a medication makes you unconscious doesn't mean it's promoting sleep. And so the question is, how much stage 3 and stage 4 sleep are you getting? And the answer with Ambien is very little. In fact, I think one of the studies that somehow was part of its FDA approval process even suggested less stage 3 and stage 4 sleep than the control. There were mixed studies. I never really understood why Ambien got approved because I don't think it actually demonstrated promoting sleep, but it does knock you out. So anyway, those are, I think, but you sort of have, that's an incremental set of steps.
Yeah, and you've mentioned Kirk Parsley. He's actually going to be on STEM Talk in the very near future. So we'll pull some more details out of him on some of the work that he's been doing and on his sleep cocktail and some of the other interesting work that he's doing. So let's move into hormone optimization, which is another longevity driver. How can we maintain the hormonal makeup of our youth? And will doing so help us live longer or just better?
So the first thing is actually to sleep, right? So much of hormone replenishment takes place during sleep. So, if you go back to those days of residency where you're sleeping, probably average 28 hours a week was sort of average sleep during residency, probably worked out to some nights 0, some nights 4, some nights 6, some nights 2. You're pretty much guaranteed to destroy your endocrine system. So before doing any hormonal optimization, you want to fix those other systems. Everything that we just talked about has to be addressed first. And the reason is, if you don't fix those things, you don't know what the underlying baseline is. So when the nutrition is right, the sleep is right, the stress management is correct, the exercise is right, then you basically reassess and say, okay, how are the 4 main endocrine systems working? So the 4 main systems, one is the sort of the fuel partitioning system, for which insulin is far and away the most dominant hormone. One is the thyroid system. One is the androgen system, sex hormones, and then one is the adrenal system. And each of these systems undergoes a pretty predictable change over time. So if you think about it sort of at an overly simplistic level, as we age, the default is to get slower, fatter, colder, less energetic. And all of those things are driven by the hormone system. So what are the more common ones, right? So the androgen system in men undergoes a pretty slow and predictable decline, whereas in women it undergoes a pretty precipitous decline at menopause. Now, I think in the case of women, there are a few topics that have generated as much controversy as hormone replacement therapy. A thoughtful discussion on it is certainly beyond the scope of what we could do now. But my thoughts are pretty clearly in the camp that the Women's Health Initiative, which was really the turning point in this debate, was a highly flawed study, and as a result has probably deprived millions of women of the hormone replacement therapy they would require to actually live not just better lives, to your question, but actually longer lives. So in other words, how do we reduce the risk of cancer? How do we reduce the risk of heart disease, dementia, and diabetes? Well, it's actually not through hormone deprivation. So when a woman is walking around with no estrogen, no progesterone, no testosterone in her body, which is what a woman looks like when she's post-menopause, right? FSH and LH are through the roof and the other hormones are unmeasurable. That is not a health-promoting state. And nor does that make a woman feel better. So in that sense, I think you're compromising both health span and lifespan. And I say that even, I just consulted with a woman recently who had ER positive DCIS, so estrogen positive receptor ductal carcinoma in situ, which is a precancerous lesion. And the question was, should she be on HRT? Now, of course, a conventional approach is hell no, because a conventional approach is nobody should be on HRT. And my approach is absolutely she should be. But she needs triple therapy. What that means is she needs estrogen. And remember, the estrogen you give it's a biased combination. So it's mostly E3, it's estriol, and it's about 80% E3, 20% E2. But then it's also, and that's given topically, so that's bioidentical. It's not synthetic, and it's not given orally. And those two things explain the majority of the complications in the WHI. And then secondly, we give oral bioidentical progesterone, never progestin. And then finally, we give testosterone. And the reason is, and again, most people are shocked to learn this, testosterone is the dominant hormone in a woman's body. It's the dominant androgen. She's got anywhere from 500 to 1,000 times more testosterone in her body than she does estrogen, even when she was premenopausal. So when you take the single most dominant androgen in a woman's body away, it's just hard for me to understand why we think that that's going to promote health. Now, look, do I advocate every single woman go on HRT? I don't. If a woman is truly, truly asymptomatic and she is afraid of the hormone, I don't see it as my job to talk her into it. So I think there are enough people that can be helped who want to feel, who first of all feel crappy and or have enough concern about the chronic diseases. And the other thing that I think bothers me, and this is one where I think, I don't know who to blame more, the scientists or the press, is there's just this goes back to maybe why having a background in mathematics is helpful but also frustrating, is people don't understand the difference between relative risk and absolute risk, and it drives me crazy. So when you look at the big findings from these, anti-HRT studies, they talk about how the women experience a 25% increase in the risk of breast cancer. Now, look, if you're sitting there at home and you're hearing that or reading that, yeah, you sure wouldn't want to do this. There's a 25% increased risk of breast cancer. Now, notwithstanding all the things I just said, which I think exacerbate that risk, specifically the use of unopposed estrogen and progesterone. So the lack of testosterone, I think, probably explains that more than anything, although it could be the synthetic progesterone. I don't know. But the bigger issue is, what's the absolute risk? Well, if you go back to those stats that I quoted, it's saying, it's a difference between 4 cases per 1,000 per year and 5 cases per 1,000 per year. So they're not lying when they say the increase is 25%, because going from 4 to 5 per 1,000 per year is a 25% relative risk increase. But that's not the jugular issue. The jugular issue is, what's the absolute risk? It's 0.1% AR. And that's what doctors do such a lousy job communicating, and that's what the press does an even lousier job communicating. And so I think it's important for a woman to understand that, yes, there might be a 0.1% absolute risk increase for breast cancer if you take HRT for 15 years. But oh, by the way, your risk of heart disease and other cancers and diabetes goes down by an AR of 5%. One of my mentors in this space is a guy by the name of Riley Lloyd, who's a GYN in Chicago. And I don't remember the numbers, but he's actually calculated that, depriving all women in the United States of HRT saves like 18 lives a year, and it costs us like 23,000 lives a year or something. I mean, it's just, and I think the numbers are worse than what I just said.
Yeah, I think they are. I think I've heard these, and they're pretty astounding numbers.
I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
So, Peter, how do you feel about taking supplements or drugs to stave off aging or to increase health span?
So I think that, one of the funniest questions I get asked and I don't give talks much, but maybe once or twice a year, but invariably I'm always going to get asked the question, do you think, and then it's fill in the blank, name of drug, is good? Or do you think fill in the blank is bad? And I just find it to be a funny question, because it's like nobody would ever go up to a carpenter and say, do you think hammers are good? Do you think Phillips screwdrivers are bad? Do you think saws are good? It's like, the question doesn't make sense. And so it doesn't make sense in the context of pharmacology, right? There's almost no absolute black and white, right? So are statins bad? I mean, I don't know. I mean, you tell me, right? It's like if a person has an elevated LDLP and or an elevated Lp(a) and their desmosterol is really high, no, a statin's actually pretty darn good, right? That's a life-saving drug. Unfortunately, most of the clinical trials are never done in homogeneous enough populations, so we are always generally being discounted in terms of seeing the actual efficacy of this. So, is I don't know, what's another drug I get asked about a lot? Like, is metformin good or bad? I mean, it's all context specific, right? I mean, metformin is an AMPK activator. Certainly in someone who's hyperinsulinemic, it's a great tool. I mean, I take metformin myself, though I'm not hyperinsulinemic. Maybe I'm not getting much benefit from it in the same way that someone would if they had very high levels of insulin. But I think the data on metformin in diabetics is so compelling that I'm willing to sort of, at least in my case, justify the potential downside of it. But also I think there's just pharmacotherapy offers us this amazing opportunity to really hack this system. So I'll give you an example, right? Like uric acid levels. When uric acid levels are high, bad things can happen, right? Now, everybody thinks about gout because it causes such a huge symptom, right? But forget gout for a moment, right? What if someone's got a uric acid of 6.5? And you've tried the main lifestyle drivers to reduce uric acid. So you've reduced meat consumption because of the pyrimidines within the meat drive this in the genetically susceptible. You've reduced fructose consumption because fructose metabolism drives up uric acid specifically. So that's not just sugar, but all fructose. And you've reduced alcohol consumption. And let's say uric acid is still elevated, but the patient's asymptomatic. Should you do anything about it? Well, if they have an elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, I think the answer is yes, because there's some evidence to suggest that uric acid crystals exacerbate atherosclerosis. And I'm always going to be fixated on heart disease. Heart disease isn't that sexy and nobody cares about it, but we lose sight of the fact that it's still the number one killer in men and women. Most women are scared to death about breast cancer. They have a 3% lifetime risk of dying of breast cancer, a 22% lifetime risk of dying of heart disease. So if I can lower someone's risk of heart disease, I've done my job. And so, I'm going to put people on drugs that are going to lower uric acid, even if they're asymptomatic, till I can get them in the 4s if I really want to push the envelope on that, if I want to deliver what we call alpha, right? Returns above the market. So look, I think there's like a toolkit of about 20 to 25 drugs that I find really helpful. And you come up with a custom solution. It's sort of like building a custom home for somebody based on what their goals are, their risks, their phenotype.
Peter, have you looked at the trade-off between berberine, a supplement, and metformin, the prescription drug? They both are AMPK activators and both have an effect on glucose. Do you have any preference between the two?
I used to take both, right? So I used to take like a gram a day of metformin BID twice a day, so 2 grams a day, and probably a gram a day of berberine. In the end, I figured it might just be overkill. And by the way, I was taking berberine more for its PCSK9 activity. So berberine, unlike metformin, in theory for PCSK9 overexpressors, should be able to reduce ApoB. I turned out to be pretty sensitive to that. But in the end, just through an effort of streamlining it, I changed up some other things in my regimen and didn't really need that PCSK9 activity on the berberine, and felt like of the two, pharmaco-grade metformin versus supplement-grade berberine, I at least have more confidence in the metformin. And frankly, the economics are no different. Metformin is basically free.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Right? It's so cheap. I think... Yeah, it's effectively free. So there wasn't an economic reason to be taking the berberine over the metformin, but I felt like I could at least. I'm going to always err on the side of a drug that's, more regulated.
I think we'll hear a lot more about metformin. There's a large longevity study looking at metformin in terms of as an actual longevity drug, and not looking at it in the context of diabetes or glucose control, but in a broad range of things. And then I saw a paper recently that seemed highly counterintuitive that had a negative outlook on metformin with respect to overactivation of AMPK. But I wasn't convinced by reading the paper. Did you see that paper?
No, I did see one kind of recently about... But it was a mouse paper, and it was talking about it had a brain model, but I thought the animal model was highly flawed. But I'd like to see this one that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
So Peter, your whole approach to increasing longevity also focuses on quality of life. So not just living longer, but living better. How does having a sense of purpose and a social support network play into all of that?
Well, these are the hardest things, I think, to get at, because we get further and further away from experimental evidence. So here we, at least as far as I can tell, we can only really rely on ecology and epidemiology. But the trends are pretty clear, right? Which is, if you try to match people across populations, people who work longer versus retire sooner have better cognitive outcomes. And that's kind of intuitive, right? Like the more, it's an oversimplification, but it feeds into this idea that the more active the brain is, the better the brain is, the moment you sort of stop having an active brain, the worse things are. So, I think we got to think about working as being about something other than money, right? Because most people's, I think, viewpoint of work and retirement is a financial one, which is I will work until this point, at which point I don't need the money anymore, and then I will not work. And instead, maybe it should be I will work forever, but at some point I won't necessarily work for money, or I won't care what the financial is. So that's one thing. I have a friend in New York, Samantha Boardman. She's a psychiatrist, and we were talking about this one day over coffee, and she said that for her patients, she does this thing which is called prescribing purpose. And I was like, God, I love the sound of that, right? Like I just like that idea because I remember being given similar advice at various stages of my life. And one of the most sage pieces of advice I was ever given was, if you're in a situation where you're feeling unhappy about something, right? Like you're sort of awfulizing about your own existence. Pause for a moment and find somebody who would give anything to be in your shoes and figure out a way to help them do that. So I remember the most profound example of this was sometime during medical school. Probably sometime during the misery of second year of medical school. And I was probably upset about something. I don't even know. But the point is, I thought, I guarantee you there's like a dozen undergrads on this campus who are stressed out about taking the MCAT and applying to medical school. Could I go and help them in some way? And if so, so it turned into a very interesting exercise, right? Which was, tutoring a couple of undergrads, not to get paid, just to sort of remind myself of how privileged I was to be in that situation, even though it felt like it sucked. And so I think that's an interesting model. I think that's an interesting tool, because I don't think there's a single person out there who can't find somebody who would actually want to be where they are. So it's more about sort of a steady and deliberate view on how do I change my view about the world, and how do I do it through sort of changing what I'm focused on, less about me, more about somebody else.
Very important approach.
Peter, what is your current view on today, the utility of genetic testing today? I know it's changing rapidly, but if you could give us the short squirt on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably a little overhyped, frankly. I think there's two components to it, right? So one is, who does the best sequence? Is it whole sequence? Is it exome? Is it intron? What does the sequencing algorithm look like? And then and I think that's actually been commoditized. And I don't know that it's as important as people make it out to be. So I know that, Illumina can do the whole thing for $10,000, and obviously 23andMe is doing something for much less than $100, and I'm guessing it's, just exome. But that's actually the less relevant part. The more relevant part is, what is the analysis? How do you take that information and do something with it? And I think to date, there's really only two areas where genetic testing offers remarkable insight. The first is with sort of the pediatric diseases of metabolism. These are very helpful, right? It's really helpful to know what the genes are on these diseases. The other area where I think it's really helpful, though, unless you're adopted, not that insightful, is the germline mutations, the cancer germline mutations, right? So should we be screening for BRCA in every 12-year-old? Maybe, but typically if they have BRCA, you're going to know it through family history. So we can't, I view family history as probably more relevant than genetic testing in terms of actionable insight. Of course, when you have somebody who's adopted or in whom the family history is unclear, then by all means, I think those things are pretty handy. But so long-winded way of saying, I'm not against genetic testing. I just don't think it's this panacea that is going to answer all the problems. I think most of the genes that we can identify, we have no clue what they're doing. And I'd prefer to focus on the things that I know, like what does it mean if your LDLP is this, or if your insulin level is this, or if your uric acid level, those. I almost prefer to focus on the phenotype at this moment rather than the genotype.
When talking about genetic testing, In the context of 23andMe, I find it fascinating that the interaction, the difficulty they had with the FDA really opened up a Pandora's box, because when that happened and 23andMe was unable to provide specific medical information or specific potential disease associations, and was really limited to providing ancestral kinds of information, an entire industry instantly sprung up, which really, didn't fall under the FDA because they didn't take your genetic material, and these were really essentially computer science places. And so you just export your 23andMe data to these folks, and there's quite a variation in the quality of the algorithms, the analysis algorithms they're using. But it is fascinating for sure.
Peter, lastly, you said that we can increase our longevity by essentially not doing stupid things. I hate simplifying it to that point, but that's kind of what it comes down to. So such as smoking or texting and driving. Is there anything specific that is kind of one of your favorite stupid things to avoid doing?
Well, I do think that in this day and age, so smoking, luckily at this point, most people are kind of getting that message, but it's the single lowest hanging fruit there is, right? So, there's, so enough said on that. I think and again, you just walk down the mortality table, right? So automotive accident is the highest cause of death that is not a chronic disease. Okay. By the way, smoking, you take that out, your odds improve dramatically on all diseases, right? Chronic and like diseases like COPD and stuff like that. So, okay, so how do we not die in a car? That's basically the problem statement, right? Okay, so 1, don't drive or don't be in a car with somebody who has alcohol in their system. And if you want to be really strict about it, it would have to be 0 alcohol, right? Because it's not like with a blood alcohol of 0.07, though you're still legal, you're as good as you are at 0. So and again, maybe that's not realistic, right? Maybe that's the trade-off. Maybe it's like, look, I want to be able to go out to my work party and have 1 drink and still drive home. But just to be clear, let's acknowledge at least the problem statement. The second is this idea of texting. I mean, it's just become an epidemic. And it's geographically, I think, I don't know that it's the same everywhere, but certainly in California, where I live, where we basically drive everywhere. I mean, it's out of control. I mean, it's just out of control. So, and that creates a problem, because not only do you have to not text and drive yourself, you basically have to assume everybody on the road is an idiot. And that's effectively true. I mean, California drivers are about the worst drivers in the country to begin with, and then you superimpose this texting issue, it becomes really problematic. And so there's 2 reasons not to text and drive, and one of them is just to pay attention to everybody else. So then you get to other ones. So where do the deaths occur? So 50% of deaths occur on the freeway. And then of the remaining 50%, the majority occur at intersections. So let's look at the intersection one. What's the most likely injury that's going to kill you at an intersection? It's going to be a left side collision when one of you is running the intersection. So meaning you have the right of way and someone runs a red and hits you on your side, T-bones you. That's the most likely injury to kill you. Or you're running the intersection and the guy with the right of way hits you. So let's assume that you can figure out how to not run the red light. That's called paying attention, not drinking all the usual shenanigans, and not being an idiot, right? Like not being an idiot. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I just scratch my head when I see somebody chasing a yellow and literally running the red.
Yeah. Blatantly
just
doing so.
Blatantly. Yeah. I mean, I see it at least once every 2 days. So when you enter an intersection, you have to remember that the probability that somebody else is doing that is non-zero. And so what you want to do is always look left before you go through an intersection. And you'll still look right, but look left first. Right. Because you look at the guy who's going to kill you first.
I like in London how they actually write on the crosswalks for pedestrians which way to look.
Yes.
Because, Yanks, as they call us, tend to look the wrong way and get clocked by a bus or something.
Oh, Yeah.
When you're
painful.
fresh off the plane and you're stumbling through town, it's like, yeah, just FYI.
Yeah.
Just a reminder.
It's a way to get a Darwin Prize.
Oh,
So, Peter, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners about longevity?
no, I've probably shared too many already.
That's great. Peter, just want to say thank you again for coming onto the podcast today.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Wow, what an interesting discussion. Much of it right at the front edge of the latest thinking of nutrition and longevity.
Don, it seems like we could have talked to Peter for hours and hours.
Absolutely.
Great show.
This is Don Carnegas, host of STEM Talk.
And Ken Ford, sometime co-host and chair of the Double Secret Selection Committee.
Saying goodbye for now.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others. So please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.